Hey guys, welcome back. I hope everybody is doing well. I've had a request to show how I would work diagonally, stitching in rows and stitching in columns. And I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was. It was somebody on Instagram. But I had somebody say that they wanted to work in rows and they weren't quite sure how to do that. So they asked me to show how I would do that. So I'm going to show you how I would work in rows and how I would work in columns diagonally. So let's get started. First of all, as always, when I do this kind of thing, I want to emphasize that this is a suggestion. There are no hard and fast rules about this. I'm just going to show you the way that I would stitch. You may have, there may be things that I do that you don't like or that you think don't make sense, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're interested, so I'm just going to show you how I would work through things, and you can take this and adapt it to your needs or preferences. As always, I would also say that if you want to learn how to stitch, if you want to try stitching diagonally, the best thing to do would be to just, on your chart, mark out a diagonal and play around with things and come up with your own style of stitching. You'll learn a lot more by doing it yourself rather than listening to me. So anyway, with those two things in mind, I'm going to show you what I would do. Also, I just want to emphasize that one of the reasons why I stitch this way is it systematically fixes a couple of problems for me. There's two principles that kind of follow with this. The first is that it is easier to bring your needle up in a hole that doesn't have a lot of threads, a lot of strands in it already. So this way makes it so that my needle always comes up in a location that is relatively empty, or has one stitch in it already. And the other thing is that when you move to a different stitch, you want to make sure that you're moving back across what you've already stitched, so that you don't elongate your legs, and this will also help you to do that. So I'm going to share with you, I have some graphs that I'm going to show you to work through to kind of show you how I would do stuff. Okay, I'm going to give you four different ways to stitch. Starting in the upper left corner and two starting in the lower right corner. You can probably use these principles if you want to start in one of the right hand corners. You can use what I'm telling you to start in one of those corners as well. And also, I am assuming that I am stitching with only one color. So if I were stitching with more than one color, then I would stitch, basically I would stitch with each color until I would do one column or row at a time, all the colors in that column before I moved on to the next column, if that makes sense. So, sorry about that. So first of all, we have this, and we are going to work in we're going to work in columns here. And so the first thing to think of is where you're going to start. And in this case, I always like to start on the long edge. So if I'm working in columns, I would want to start over on this edge, because that's the long edge. If I were working in columns and started here, I'd have to count over 10 stitches and then work back across this way, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You may consider you may want to do that. I don't know. You could do it either way. I like starting on the long edge. Okay, so we're going to start on this column. The next thing we want to consider is what side of the stitches we're going to come up on. So as I work across, on the left-hand side, you're gonna have the stitches that have already been stitched on the left-hand side. And so that means I want to bring my needle up on the right-hand side where there haven't been any stitches worked yet. And the third thing to consider is how you make your cross. So when I make a cross, I make this leg first, and then I make this leg second. That means that if I'm going to be coming up on the right-hand side of the stitch, that means I'm going to be coming up here on this part of the leg and going down here. And if you think about how you work, it would make sense to make your stitches going down and then coming back up, just because if I were to go up this way, it just doesn't make as much sense. So that means that I'm going to work from the top down to the bottom here. Okay, and so I'm gonna come up here, go down here, all the way down, and then I will come up here and go down here to complete the cross going back up. So that means my first stitch is going to be up in the corner, and I'll stitch half stitches all the way down. So that's 10 half stitches, and then I would come back up this way. Okay. So that's one column, and as I said, assuming I am stitching in one color, I would have done all of that. If there were more colors, like if there were 2 or 3 colors, I would stitch each of the 3 colors in this column and park my thread in the next column or wherever that's used, and I wouldn't move over to this next column until this column is complete. And then the next column, I would do the same thing, only this time there's only 9 stitches. And then I would come up this way, right? And I would continue to work that way all the way across the triangle until I got up here to the top. So that would start me out with my first triangle. The next stitch that I would do would be a parallelogram, and I would start on this parallelogram. I would start here, and I would work the same way all the way up until I hit that, and of course then I'd have another triangle that I would finish. Okay, and I would just continue working that way. So that's how I would start if I was starting in the upper left column, the upper left corner, and working in columns. Okay, so now I'm going to insert a video in here of me working this corner, stitching a corner like this. It's not going to be a 10-stitch corner. I think I'm only going to do about 5 stitches, a 5-stitch corner just to save time. The concept's just the same. So I'll insert that video here. Okay, now let's move on. This time we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner and we're going to work in rows. So once again, the first thing to decide is I'm going to start with the long side, which means that I'm going to work this row first here, not this row. I'm going to work this row because this is only one stitch. Okay. Now, as the next thing we consider is what side of the stitch we're going to come up on. So as I work this, the stitched rows are going to be on top. That means I'm going to want to bring my needle up on the bottom of the stitch. And once again, if I make my stitches like this, that means that I'm going to be coming up here on this side and going down here. That means that it makes sense that I would want to work this way across the rows. So, once again, starting up here, this is how I would work this. I would stitch this row like this, and then I would come back and complete the crosses going this way. Okay, and then the next row I would do the same thing. And come back. Okay, and I would continue stitching my rows until I finish that triangle. Okay, now when I start the next diagonal, I would want to start back up here again. So I would stitch a diagonal that looked like this, right? So I would stitch, I would stitch all of these rows in that parallelogram, and then I would finish this triangle until that was done. And then I would continue working that way. Okay, so that's working in rows. I'm going to insert a video here showing me working one of these triangles in rows. Okay, next let's do starting in the bottom left hand corner, and we're going to be stitching in columns. And so once again we decide where we're going to start. We start on the long edge, so since I'm going to be working in columns, that means I'm going to start on this column and I'm going to work this way. What side of the stitch am I going to come up on? Well, I am going to come up on, well, as I work this way, the stitches to the left will be completed and the stitches to the right will be empty. So I'm going to once again want to come up on the right hand side. If I am making my stitches like that and coming up on the right hand side, that means that I'm going to come up on this side and go down this side, and that means that it makes sense to work from the top back down to the bottom. So what that means is I'm going to want to start in this stitch up here. So I'm going to want to count 10 stitches up from the corner and start here. And once again, I would stitch half stitches and then complete the cross going back up. And then I would stitch on the next column, I would stitch half stitches down and then complete the cross going back up. And I would continue stitching each column till I got down to here. Okay, so the next one I would want to start on this edge again, and I would want to stitch a diagonal like this. And once again, I would stitch columns working down like this until I finished that parallelogram. And then I would stitch another triangle. Okay? And I would continue working that way from this edge down. Okay? Now I'm going to insert another video here showing me working, making this triangle in columns. So here it is right here. Okay. Final case. We're going to start in the bottom left corner, working in rows. Okay. Working in rows. And once again, where am I going to start? I'm going to start on the long edge of the triangle. So working in rows, that means I'm going to stitch this, start with this row. Okay. Consider what side am I going to come up with my needle? So here, as I stitch up in rows, the stitches on the bottom are going to be completed and the stitches on top are not. So that means I'm going to want to come up in the top of the corner. So if I make my stitch like this, that means that I'm going to want to come up in the top and go down in the bottom. Okay, and then it also means that I am going to want to work this way across the row. Okay, so once again, I'm going to count out 10 stitches from the corner, and I'm going to start here in this stitch. And of course, I would do half stitches all the way across the row, and then completely across going back. The next row, I would do the same thing, half stitches coming across, and then going back. And I would continue working each row until I got up to the top. Okay? So the next diagonal that I would work, I would want to start back down here on the bottom. So that diagonal will look something like this. And I would work each row going across to complete that parallelogram. And then I would work this triangle up here to complete the diagonal. And I would continue to work this way across the diagonals. So once again, I'm going to insert a video here showing me stitching this triangle working in rows. So that'll go right here. Okay, great. So once again, thank you for spending time with me. I hope that this is helpful in showing you how I would stitch diagonally if I were stitching in rows or columns. If you have any comments about this or any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing from you. If you have a suggestion about a better way that I could stitch, I'm always open to that as well. And as always, as I said before, these are suggestions about how I would work. You may want to work differently. If you're working diagonals, there's no hard or fast rules. Anyway, I hope that you have found this helpful and that you will continue to watch my videos. Thanks, and we will talk to you later. Goodbye.